Hello and welcome to my Vray 3 for Rhino 6 tutorial on exterior lighting with HDRIs. In this tutorial we're going to cover how to set up a sun, set up an HDRI, make sure that the sun and the HDRI are working together and fully synced to get a nice beautiful, more atmospheric lighting for your exterior scene. And yeah, so let's just get right into it. First thing I'll say, this tutorial is intended for Vray 3 for Rhino 6. So some of these settings we're going to tweak may be different in other versions. So keep that in mind. The other thing I'll say is that this is building on my previous tutorial that is dealing with the Vray global settings. So if you haven't seen that tutorial, go ahead and run through that to make sure your Vray settings are up to speed to match what we'll be demonstrating in this tutorial. So let's get right in. We have our scene here of this little house that we'll be working with. It's just a way to demonstrate some of the properties. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and get my sun sorted out and figured out which way it's coming from and how it's affecting the model. So if you go over here to the right to your Properties tab, you see this little sun icon. If you don't see it, you can just hit the settings and come down and make sure that the sun is checked. Once in here, you can see your sun positions and options here. For most of my renderings, I like to just have it run by manual control. There are options to pick the exact location and time of day based on where your project is located. I like to keep things a little bit more simple and just do a manual control, mostly because I can just have much more control over it. When it comes to setting up my scene lighting, I tend to err on the side of making it so that I get the shadows where I want them and get the project to look the best. Not necessarily concerned with exactly the perfect, solar angle that a specific site has. I just want to make my image from my particular view look the best. So the best way to start to figure that out is if we double click on our viewport drop down over here and we look at our project in plan. That plan would actually match our sun position plan here. So we can see right now the default is that my sun is coming in from the south, which is the bottom of my plan view here. I'm looking here at my main perspective. This is the view I'm going to be rendering overall. So when I have a view like this, typically what I like to do is have my sun coming from one of the two vanishing points, meaning so coming off of the far left or the far right. And since this scene in particular is so left focus, most of the building is on the left, I'm going to want this sun coming in on the left. So if we look at that in plan, it's really coming in from the southeast corner right here. So to make sure that's what we have, I can just click and drag my sun over here. So I'm coming in at a pretty shallow angle off the south. And my height is a little high. I'm actually going to bring this a little bit lower down here. So sort of getting to the late afternoon dusk time frame, but coming in off the south here. And that should lock that in right there. So if we go back to my main perspective, and really quick just to see a sort of starting point render, I will just hit play. And again, this file is already loaded with the global settings that we set up in the previous tutorial, so go ahead and do that if you haven't. All of that stuff is ready to go. I have my quality settings at low. My image width is fairly small, just to keep this moving fast. One thing I am going to do is come to my material override. So this is a great tool for setting up your exterior lighting, because in general we're not totally concerned with what our materials are at this moment. We're just concerned with making sure our light quality, so we can basically just do this in a grayscale, and this will lower the rendering time, so you don't have to spend a lot of time getting these settings just right. You can just override that. And so what's going to happen is it's going to override it to this color, so I can go in here and adjust that. And usually just a nice light gray is something to override all my materials. Will keep things moving fast. I'm going to go into my materials real quick. There is one material that I don't want to override, and that's going to be my glass, and we'll see why once we get to the HDRI. But if you go into whatever you're working in, go to your glass file, and if you don't have one made, now would be the time to build one. And again, you can see the tutorial on creating materials with more help with that. But for this tutorial, the glass is already in here. I'm going to go over to my write options, and where it says can be overridden, I am going to uncheck that. So now this particular material cannot be overridden, therefore it won't render my glass as light gray, it'll render my glass as glass. All of these other things like my wood siding, it says it can be overridden, so that will be turned into gray. Some of this concrete will also just be rendered as light gray and not as the concrete material itself. So let's go ahead and hit play, and well, first let's go to my view just for consistency, so everything is set to the main perspective. And let's hit render, and let's see where our starting point is. And so, unsurprisingly, things are a little washed out at first, which is fine. Part of this is because the settings that I have loaded are designed for the final product of this tutorial, meaning that they're designed for a blending of the Rhino sun with an HDRI. So the starting point of that, if you sort of reverse through that logic, is it starts off extremely washed out, which is totally fine. But I wanted to just give you a quick view of where we're coming from. All right, now that that's finished, we can see, again, everything's washed out, but what we can at least tell is that the shadows are coming the right way, so my sun is coming the right way, and as we sort of work through some settings, this will become more and more clear. So let's minimize that. Let's jump right back into those settings and see what we can do to start getting this a little bit better. The first thing I am going to look at is come to my lights tab here. And so you can see the Rhino document sun. This is the default Rhino sun is already built into this. The intensity is set to 1, the size multiplier is set to 1. There's a lot of other settings here that get into some very nuanced things, but because we're going to be adding an HDRI that's going to kind of cover all that, I can just play with two things here. The first thing is the intensity multiplier. What I want to do is actually bring this way, way, way down because we're going to be lighting with an HDRI, not just the sun. So I'm going to drop this all the way down to 0.03. Again, that's 0.03, not 0.3. And the size multiplier, this is going to affect the sort of fuzziness of the shadows. I'm going to drop this down to 5 right now, but we'll come back and we'll play with it to show exactly what the difference is. So I've really, really reduced the sun in this instance here. So let's minimize this, and we'll do a quick render to see how much that has helped. All right, so as you can see here, we're getting a much more even lighting. We can see the way directions our shadow is moving, that our light is coming from the angle that we like. And we're sort of getting a very flat light, meaning that everything's coming in. It's got a little bit of yellowish tone to it. That's probably starts to be because of the low setting we are in the sky. It starts to get that warmer feel. But again, this isn't super atmospheric. It's very sort of flat and simple. If we zoom in a little bit here, we can see our shadows get a little bit more fuzzy as they move away from the source of them. That's again this shadow bias that we were toying with. And just to show you a quick example, what I'm going to do here is turn on my my render window here, and I'm just going to draw a little box here. So now when I do a render test, it'll only render within that box and not the entire thing over, because I want to just demonstrate what's happening with my shadows. So I'll minimize that. I'll go to my settings, and so if we change this back down to 0, for example, and go back to my render window, and hit render. We can see the difference here is that nice crisp line, the really hard shadow. And if I go back, and bring this way up to maybe like 9 or so. We'll hit render, and you can see it becomes much, much more fuzzy. So again, this is that trying to get that perfect shadow that starts to get a little fuzzier as it gets away from the source of the shadow. What I found is a good spot to generally keep this is usually about 5 or 6. So I'm going to just bring this back down to 5 and leave it there. So now that we have our sun more or less set up where we want it, what we want to do is incorporate the HDRI to the equation, because right now we just have a black background, we're not giving our glass anything to reflect, and we're not getting a more atmospheric quality that a sky would actually give. This is sort of the generic, strong, single directional light source. So when we're adding an HDRI, the best way to do that is to use the dome light tool in your Vray lights. If you don't see the Vray light options, you can always just pull up the toolbar. So if you go to show toolbar, and again, I just right-clicked in anywhere in the toolbars for this little dialog box to come up. You go to show toolbar, I'll go all the way down, all your Vray tools should be here if you're not seeing these the same way my screen is. But what I'm looking for is this dome light. So I'm just going to click on this here. You can see it's asking me for a location. It doesn't matter where I put this at all. It's going to work the same way. It just needs a location in the file. So I'll just click anywhere. You can see immediately it pulls me to a dialog box to choose the dome light texture, which is your HDRI. So I'm going to go to the file where I have kept that, and I have an HDRI that I have found available free online. If you do a little bit of digging, a lot of various websites give you free HDRs to do some things like this and do some experimenting, some testing. So certainly, do a quick Google search and you'll find at least 1 or 2 free HDRIs to use as your own way to test this. Now that that is locked in there, we'll do a real quick render to see what's going to happen. But before I do that, actually, let's go back to our top view and let's look at that light. So this is now, this arrow right here, this represents my new HDR dome light. And so what this is telling me from a bigger conceptual idea is that I now have a dome light that's encompassing the entire project, and that dome light is an HDRI that is stretched to be the new dome. So the default in Rhino is simply just a white dome that has an even lighting on your scene. We've replaced that with an HDRI. And for those of you who don't know what an HDRI is or why I keep referring to this type of file, it's essentially a JPEG of a sky panorama, except for that it has some lighting qualities embedded within the file, meaning that it has a sun and a bright spot, and when I rotate this dome, which unfortunately you can't quite see until we render it, that will in fact change the way the light quality comes in. And so it's important to know that this changes based on how you rotate it, and it changes based on where this arrow is pointing. So this arrow is pointing to the sun in my HDR. So to demonstrate what that means, I am going to take this arrow and rotate it so that it's facing perfectly south. And then I'm going to come into my perspective and I'm not even going to worry about my image here. I'm just going to come off here and just look off into the distance. I'm basically just looking south in my virtual Rhino world. The house is completely out of view. And I'm just going to hit render to show you what's really happening here. Oops. You can see I only rendered this tiny little box because I left my box on there. I'll just click that again to turn that off and hit render. Now it'll render the entire scene. So the difference here now you can see is that we no longer have just the generic black background. We actually have a whole stretched sky scene, and this goes full 360. So it had down this particular HDRI that I'm using is a little bit more at a dusk setting, but you can see it has some beautiful clouds, and it has a hot spot, we'll say. So this is where the sun is in this image. And if I were to turn and look north now, so I'm looking away from the sun, we can see the other side of that image. And here you can actually see the seam where that image is wrapped 360 around my object, or around my environment, and that's the scene where it comes together, because when whoever made this free HDRI didn't quite make that clean enough, which is fine because we don't actually ever see this. We're just using it for its lighting qualities. So here is going to be the darker side of this image, and if you remember from before, south is going to be the bright side. And so what's going to happen is that is going to light up my scene the same way it would light up a building in reality, meaning that the sun itself will be brighter because of the sun in the image. So if I go to my plan view, and if I remember back when I looked at my sun, I set it up so that my sun was coming in from like a south-southeast and coming in about that height, which is about where the sun's setting in my HDRI. So if I take my HDRI dome, which is again just represented by this little arrow here, just to keep track of where the sun is in that HDRI. What I want to do is actually just rotate this little arrow to match my sun angle. So it's a little bit of backwards, right? So the sun is coming from southeast to the center point here at that height, and then my HDRI is pointing back to the sun. So if the sun's coming southeast to my object, this is pointing to the southeast to the sun. So now these are working the same way. If I were to do this backwards, it would be brighter on the shadow side of the building, and you'd have conflicting light sources, which your eye would quickly catch if something is not quite right. So now that this is pointing the right direction, I now have a Rhino sun and an HDRI that are coming from the same direction. So now let's see what that looks like. I'll go back to my saved view so everything keeps rendering consistent. And let's just hit render and see what the difference is. Right, so we can see there's a very, very different overall look and feel to this rendering. So let's just cover a few things that are happening here. One, we're seeing the HDRI that's affecting our image in the background. Keep in mind, this will save. If I were to go here and save this as a PNG, it'll actually save that image of the sky in the background with it. If you don't want that to save, all you need to do is go into your lighting settings. So again, back to the asset editor, and you can see under my lighting settings, this Vray dome light has appeared here. All you need to do is click on this options tab and click invisible. This will make it so that that does not save with it. It's usually not much of an issue, because if you go back to that image, if you followed the previous tutorial settings and you are also rendering out a material ID, which it looks like I need to update a few settings on that. Oh, actually, the reason this material ID isn't showing anything is because I have my material override, so it's not also overriding my material IDs. So that's something we'll need to fix as well. But typically, if you have a material ID, it'll allow you to just select the sky in Photoshop with a magic wand and just delete it itself. So there's a number of ways to make sure this doesn't save, or if you'd like it to save, that is sort of the easiest option. So that's what's happening in the background. But let's more importantly look at how it's affecting the model. If you remember before, just the typical Rhino sun that was coming in was sort of a harsh, flat yellow light. This has a lot more nuance in it. So not only are we seeing the nuance and the color variations in this landscape and the materials it's hitting in different planes, we also have now given the glass something to reflect. So the key to glass, and we'll get into this a little bit more with the material tutorial, but the key with glass is really giving the glass needs to reflect something to look like it's reflective, as well as be somewhat transparent. And again, we'll get into that in a different tutorial. So now that the glass is something to be transparent, and that would apply to any sort of reflective material. So right now I have the material override, so we're not even getting the full benefit of what this HDRI will do. We can only just see how it's affecting certain things. But for example, if this steel up here was created a material that feels like that has a nice subtle blurred reflection, like a steel beam might, that would also have some nice nuances and variations in the color along the length of it, because it's going to pull in some of that light from the sky. So we can see this is a significant improvement to the overall lighting source, or to your exterior lighting. And from here, to sort of edit this and tweak and play with some settings, really what you're going to want to do is going to be playing with where the sun is. So again, if we wanted to try the sun coming from the northeast, I would just pull this over here, and then I would just take my HDRI and make sure that's matching it, and I would rotate it so it's coming into the same way. And then they'll always feel synced up, and you can always adjust these settings to get to the lighting that you're desired. If we go back to our lighting settings, we can see here the V-Ray dome, the intensity is fine to just leave that at 1 for most HDRIs. If it's a little bit too bright or too dark, you can just tweak that number just a little bit. But again, the sun wants to be down here very, very small at 0.03. And the last thing we'll just kind of discuss is some of the high-level conceptual reasons we have both and we're trying to sync them. And the reason for that is because the HDRI itself is not going to provide a shadow. So it will give you the nice subtle glow, and it's going to be brighter. It's going to brighter towards the side that's closest to the sun within the HDRI, and it'll give you all these nice subtle lighting effects, but it won't give us the shadows. So if we look at this image and we think about why this image is great, it's because we're getting some very nice color variations, but we have some really nice shadows that are coming off of the building as well that are starting to get a little bit fuzzy as they move out. And then we see the shadow coming out of here. So you really want both of those. You want the hard shadows from the real sun, and you want the subtle atmospheric effects from the HDRI. So the best way to do it is to sync them both up and lower the sun setting so it's not overpowered by the HDRI, and let the HDRI handle the light and the sun handle the shadows, and together you get a nice clean output. So that'll do it for setting up the exterior lighting.